Hey guys, tonight we begin with the forgotten story of the Black Death in 14th century China and how this terrifying catastrophe played a role in the collapse of the mighty Mongol-led Yuan Dynasty. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome everyone to the channel Historian Podcast. The chilling line from the 1331 chronicle about 9 out of every 10 people perishing in Hunan province immediately grips you. It's a terrifying snapshot of a catastrophe that most people only associate with Europe. We're going to dive into the fragmented yet haunting records to trace the Black Death's trajectory and immense impact in Yuan-era China, a story often overshadowed by the European experience. This was an empire uniquely positioned to both facilitate and suffer from the world's first truly global pandemic, thanks to the interconnectedness forged by the Pax Mongolica and the thriving trade along the Silk Road. We must first picture this world a vast empire ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan, a period of unprecedented East-West exchange, but also one marked by mounting environmental and political stress, like droughts, famine, and simmering rebellion. The stage was set for disaster, a population weakened, and a vast conduit for the pathogen to spread right across Afro-Eurasia. The records for the 14th century in China are sparse when it comes to a detailed medical history of the plague, but they are undeniably dramatic. The earliest reports surface in the early 1330s. The 1331 devastation in Hunan, specifically Yongzhou, is staggering. Consecutive years of drought were followed by a great pestilence, where the dead were allegedly 19 out of 20, a phrase that certainly suggests a mortality rate approaching total societal collapse. Now, even if we assume this is a rhetorical flourish, an expression of absolute horror rather than a precise census figure, it conveys a sense of terror and loss that is hard for us to grasp today. Imagine the absolute silence that would fall over a farming village where 95% of the inhabitants simply vanished. This early eruption in south-central China around 1331 is a bit of an odd detail because modern research generally points to a Central Asian origin around the Tian Shan Mountains, slightly later in the 1330s. Historians still debate whether this early Hunan epidemic was truly the bubonic plague or a different but equally catastrophic disease, perhaps typhus or hemorrhagic fever exacerbated by famine. However, its severity and its timing so close to the proven Central Asian outbreak make the possibility of it being a highly lethal strain of Yersinia pestis extremely compelling. The fact that the first documented explosions of mass death in China coincide almost exactly with the plague's initial confirmed emergence near the Yuan Empire's western frontier is a chilling alignment of events. Let's pause and consider the sensory experience of this early devastation. The overwhelming smell of unburied dead must have been a constant suffocating presence in the humid air of Hunan. The scent of putrefaction mingled with the dry dust kicked up by years of drought would have created a truly hellish environment. Imagine the despair of the survivors hauling bodies, sometimes their own children or parents, to makeshift pits, the skin raw and blistered from the effort under the unrelenting sun. This exhaustion was compounded by the knowledge that no matter how many they buried, the pestilence still stalked the living. It must have felt like the gods themselves had turned their backs, a palpable, oppressive weight. The traditional narrative that the plague arose in China and then moved west is complicated by the 2022 discovery in Kaijisan, which places the confirmed genetic source of the Black Death in the 1330s just west of the Yuan border. This evidence suggests a pattern of radiation, a pathogen spreading both east and west along the same trade arteries. The interconnectedness of the Mongol Empire, a source of its wealth and power, became its fatal vulnerability. Think of the Silk Road less as a romantic highway of spices and silk, and more as a massive biological conduit. Every Mongol soldier, every merchant's caravan, every horse and every packed bale of goods carried rats and fleas, the unwitting vehicles of the unseen killer. It's like a superhighway of death, a little bit of a dark irony considering the Pax Mongolica was supposed to bring peace, not pestilence. By the mid-1330s, the focus of the outbreaks shifts north, mirroring the likely path along the major trade routes. In 1333-34, severe pestilence is recorded in Hebei, the populous province surrounding the Yuan capital, and in Shanxi province. The figures cited here are equally astonishing, claiming that over 5 million people died in Hebei in 1 year, or that 90% of the population perished. Again, this 5 million figure from later summaries should be taken with a grain of salt. It likely aggregates deaths from multiple years or multiple causes, but the sentiment is clear catastrophic depopulation. The repeated phrase, 10 households, 9 empty, is not just poetic license, it is the language of an apocalyptic memory. The situation was dire. The constant anxiety of not knowing who would be next, the sound of relentless coughing that signaled the dreaded spitting blood plague, and the heavy thud as a relative collapsed into a feverish delirium must have made every day a waking nightmare. One could feel the oppressive heat of the fever radiating from the sick, a heat that seemed to consume the body from the inside out, and the constant, desperate plea for water that often went unheeded. It's a bizarre thought, but the very strength of the Yuan Empire, its ability to connect east and west so efficiently, meant that its people were now paying the ultimate price for globalization 1,000 years too early. The contemporary evidence that does survive lends chilling credence to the scale of the horror. That report from Luan in southeast Shanxi, describing hard lumps grow on the neck or arm like clotted blood, and people spat blood suddenly and died, aligns perfectly with the symptoms of bubonic plague swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, and pneumonic plague, which is highly contagious, and involves coughing up bloody sputum. While the Chinese at the time did not have the later term shuyi or rat pestilence, their literal descriptions of guan or bump plague and tuxuan or spitting blood plague are clinical in their accuracy. This wasn't just a regular epidemic. This was something new and ferociously lethal, striking entire families down within days. It's a bit like naming a disease the headache that makes your arm fall off. Pretty direct, right? The disease was not a single continuous wave, but rather a series of brutal pulses. Throughout the 1330s and 1340s, waves of epidemics struck various parts of China, often coinciding with other environmental calamities, like drought and famine. This convergence of disasters is key. A population weakened by years of hunger and social strife is the perfect host for a killer like the plague. It's a legitimate historical event, the 1334 epidemic in Hebei, as chronicled in the records of the time, is a crucial and often overlooked point in the Black Death's history that establishes its presence in Asia years before its arrival in Europe. We are so used to the European narrative, but the story of the plague's onset in China is one of terrifying silence and fragmented records. The disease struck the empire's heartland, first the north and central provinces, where the population density and the turmoil of war and famine provided ample kindling for the fire. The sheer terror of witnessing entire households wiped out must have caused a profound social breakdown. The tactile feeling of a community disintegrating is hard to imagine. The empty fields, the silence where children's voices once were, and the lingering cold of abandoned homes. Even the simplest tasks like collecting water or fetching firewood would have been fraught with the risk of encountering the invisible sickness. This ongoing catastrophe was viewed by many as a clear sign of cosmic displeasure. The Yuan Dynasty was already seen by many ethnic Han Chinese as illegitimate the rule of the Mongol conquerors. The succession of droughts, locusts, famines, floods, and now this terrifying pestilence was for many the clearest possible proof that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. Historians still debate whether the plague was the primary cause or merely an accelerator of the Yuan dynasty's collapse, but it undoubtedly added a terrifying moral and logistical burden onto an already failing regime. It's a harsh way to get a performance review from the cosmos, but when your mandate is based on delivering peace and prosperity, and you get plague and famine instead, it's time to update your resume. The early 14th century Chinese records paint a picture not of a single event, but of a society battered by constant shocks, the plague being the most devastating. It's a poignant and brutal start to our journey, showing that the disaster we call the Black Death was truly a pan-Eurasian event, starting in the east and then raging westward. The terrifying early reports from Hunan and Hebei in the 1330s set the stage. But the question remains, how did the plague, a bacterium that thrives in rodent populations, get from the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia all the way to the Chinese heartland? This brings us back to the Mongol Empire and the Pax Mongolica. The Mongol Peace. A period of relative stability across the vast Eurasian landmass was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it facilitated the greatest exchange of goods, technology, and culture the world had ever seen. On the other hand, it created a superhighway for the Yersinia pestis bacterium. The Mongol rulers themselves were constantly moving. Their armies, envoys, and immense baggage trains crisscrossed the steppes and deserts following established trade routes. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious metals regularly traveled between Yuan China and the distant reaches of Persia and the Middle East. Historians still debate the precise vectors, but the consensus is that the plague traveled along these routes, most likely carried by infected black rats, Rattus rattus, hitchhiking in merchant wagons, or more directly by the fleas, Xenopsilla chaopus, that feasted on them. Imagine a huge caravan finally reaching the safety of a major trading hub, like Gansu or Beijing, after months on the road. The merchants would have been relieved, the sense of exhaustion washing over them as they finally collapsed into their beds in an inn. But tucked away in the shadows of their cargo were the tiny stowaways. The warmth of the inn, the abundance of grain storage, and the proximity to human settlements created the perfect conditions for the infected fleas to jump from their rat hosts to human hosts, particularly if the original host died. The tactile feeling of a flea bite may have been dismissed as a minor nuisance, a common irritation of travel, but that small, almost imperceptible prick was the needle injecting the pestilence into the bloodstream. This interconnectedness of the Mongol world is an odd or unusual detail, because for centuries before this period, the plague had been confined to isolated natural reservoirs in Central Asia. The sheer size of the Mongol Empire, a continuous political entity that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, effectively broke down the natural barriers that had previously contained the disease. It's a bizarre thought, but the Mongols' military success and administrative brilliance inadvertently laid the foundation for a global pandemic. They built the perfect network for disaster, a bit like upgrading the internet connection only to realize you've opened up the world to the worst kind of virus. The foreign accounts of the plague's origin, though based on hearsay and hyperbole, also confirm the Mongol connection. The Arab scholar Ibn al-Wardi, writing as the plague hit the Middle East, claimed the scourge arose in the land of darkness, then spread to China, India, and beyond. The Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing a generation later, asserted that entire nomadic tribes in Central Asia all perished without apparent reason. While these claims of total depopulation were exaggerations, they underscore the contemporary belief that the plague radiated out of Inner Asia along the Mongol arteries. These foreign reports essentially confirm that the devastating events in China were not isolated epidemics, but part of the same transcontinental cataclysm that would later sweep the West. The first big pulse of plague appears to have struck the northern part of the Yuan Empire, consistent with the route from Central Asia through the Gansu corridor and on to the populous North China plain. The outbreaks in Hebei and Shaanxi in 1333-34 were likely the direct result of this westward migration of the pathogen along the trade and military routes. The constant movement of people fleeing famine or war only served to accelerate the spread. Imagine the sound of thousands of refugees shuffling along the dusty roads, their footsteps heavy with despair and uncertainty, unintentionally carrying the sickness to the next town. The UN government's response, or lack thereof, was crucial. Unlike the maritime city-states of Italy, which could close their ports, the vast land-based Mongol Empire was simply too expansive and decentralized to impose effective regional controls, even if they had understood the concept of contagion. Their main administrative action was often to grant tax remission when communities were devastated, a tacit admission of the scale of the depopulation. This legitimate historical event of administrative response tax remissions due to high mortality rates is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have that the population loss was immense and acknowledged by the state. The environment only compounded the disaster. The early 14th century saw China racked by natural disasters, including locust infestations, droughts, and the catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River, which changed its course in 1351. These events led to widespread famine. A starving peasant population with weakened immune systems was far more susceptible to the plague than a well-fed one. You could literally taste the desperation in the air, the metallic tang of hunger, and the stale smell of fear clinging to every village. It's the ultimate bad luck combo famine, weakening the host and the Mongol roads delivering the lethal pathogen, a bit like getting a flat tire just as a hurricane hits. The accounts of death are terrifyingly vague yet specific. The phrase, "whole families perished," noted in the Shaanxi records points to the highly lethal nature of the disease and the presence of the pneumonic form, which allowed for easy person-to-person transmission within the close quarters of a home. If the bubonic form relies on the rat-flea-human chain, the pneumonic form essentially cuts out the middleman, turning a single cough into a death sentence. The feeling of the onset of the pneumonic plague must have been agonizing, a sudden searing pain in the chest, followed by the terrifying realization that one's breath was quickly running out. The texture of the bloody sputum spat out was a horrifying, tangible sign of the body's utter collapse. The convergence of all these factors, plague, trade routes, famine, and political collapse, created a perfect storm for the Yuan Dynasty's final decades. The very forces that built the empire would now tear it down. The interconnectedness that brought wealth now brought ruin. The stability that enabled trade now enabled death. It's a powerful, tragic example of how history's greatest moments of connection can also be its most catastrophic. The initial explosions of pestilence in Hunan and the North China plain, particularly in Hebei and Shaanxi, were not just isolated outbreaks. They were a profound signal of the mandate of heaven, withdrawing its favor from the Mongol rulers. These were not merely high death tolls, they were signs of deep cosmic and political disorder interpreted through the lens of traditional Chinese belief. The mid-1330s saw the pestilence raging around the capital, a clear indication that the center of the empire itself was vulnerable. Chinese chroniclers often noted major calamities alongside political failures. When a severe pestilence occurred in Hebei in 1334, which allegedly claimed 5 million lives, It was often recorded alongside other disasters like drought and locusts, a classic sign of imperial mismanagement. These natural disasters were not random events. They were portents, warnings that the emperor was failing in his duties to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. The feeling of dread in the capital Khanbalik, or Dadu, the great capital, modern-day Beijing, must have been almost physical, the thick sense of anxiety and impending doom that permeated the atmosphere as officials themselves began to fall ill. The description of the epidemic in Shaanxi in the 1330s is particularly chilling. It speaks of a mysterious pestilence where those attacked had hard lumps grow on the neck or arm like clotted blood, and that entire families perished. This is the legitimate historical event of the disease's impact, recorded by local chroniclers. The language here is vivid and deeply unsettling. The term clotted blood likely refers to the dark hemorrhagic nature of the buboes, or the internal bleeding that often accompanied septicemic plague. The shock of witnessing a seemingly healthy person suddenly coughing up blood and dying swiftly from the pneumonic form must have been devastating. The sound of that cough, a rasping, terrifying noise, would have echoed through the tightly packed homes, a harbinger of imminent death and a chilling reminder of the air itself being contaminated. This brings us to an odd or unusual detail. The Chinese government's response to this catastrophe was often spiritual and symbolic, rather than strictly medical or administrative in the modern sense. The Yuan court would order Buddhist prayers or Taoist ceremonies to appease the heavens. They also frequently decreed general amnesties, believing that releasing criminals and performing acts of compassion would mollify heaven's anger and convince the deities to lift the calamity. Imagine the chaos of the capital during such a time. The streets filled with monks chanting sutras, the incense thick in the air, attempting to mask the smell of sickness, and the constant stream of rumors and prophecies about the end times. The sheer mortality in the north is difficult to overstate. The staggering numbers cited 90% death in some areas, even if exaggerated, speak to a complete societal breakdown. The tactile feeling of utter exhaustion must have gripped the few survivors, those who had to perform the grim work of burying the dead and keeping the society afloat. Their hands would have been constantly raw and blistered from the labor, their bodies aching from the unrelenting stress and the ever-present hunger. Historians still debate whether the Yuan Dynasty's response was inadequate due to Mongol indifference or simply overwhelmed by the combined scale of war, famine, and plague. Given the severity of the crisis and the political turmoil already brewing, it's certainly hard to fault them entirely for not inventing modern epidemiology on the spot. It's a tough gig being an emperor when the cosmos is actively trying to fire you. The stories of mass death eventually found their way west, albeit heavily filtered and sensationalized. We heard how foreign chroniclers exaggerated the toll, claiming 20 million dead in China before the plague even reached the Mediterranean. This speculation, while inaccurate, highlights a crucial point. China was seen as the distant source of the catastrophe, the place where the fire first ignited. The fear and confusion in Europe mirrored the fear and confusion in China, just with a 3 to 4 year delay. The outbreaks in the north set the precedent for the later wider waves. The northern populations already suffered immensely from years of drought and constant military conflict, leading to significant displacement and starvation. Famine weakened the people and drove refugees out of the villages. As these refugees fled, they carried the disease with them along the Grand Canal, the river systems, and the remaining roads, effectively spreading the infection deeper into the central and eventually southern provinces of China. The constant sound of the war drums and the wailing of mourners would have blended into a single cacophony of despair across the North China plain, a symphony of collapse. The accounts from Luan describing the victims spitting blood also strongly suggest that the pneumonic form of the plague was widespread, especially in the colder climate of the north. This form of the disease spreads directly from person to person through aerosol droplets, bypassing the need for the rat flea vector, which made it incredibly efficient at wiping out entire households in a matter of days. The speed and certainty of the death associated with the spitting blood plague must have been profoundly terrifying, far exceeding the dread inspired by even the most common fevers or dysenteries. It was a visible sign of an invisible, highly contagious airborne killer. The Yuan court did attempt to respond through administrative means when mass mortality occurred by granting tax relief and labor exemptions. But these were reactive measures, a bureaucratic acknowledgement of the disaster, rather than a proactive attempt to contain the spread. By the 1340s, the plague was an established feature of the Chinese landscape, a recurring nightmare that contributed to the general sense of chaos and the impending fall of the dynasty. The apocalyptic descriptions of empty towns and skeletal populations were not just literary devices. They were the grim reality of life in late Yuan China. The sparse but terrifying descriptions of the illness circulating in China during the 1330s and 1340s provide the strongest link to the Black Death witnessed in the West. Chinese writers at the time didn't have the sophisticated medical language to identify the disease as Yersinia pestis, but they did have powerful descriptive colloquial terms. Two phrases stand out: Guwen, bump plague, and Tuxuwen, spitting blood plague. The term Guwen literally translates to bump pestilence or boil plague, and is a visceral description of the disease's most iconic and terrifying symptom, the swollen lymph nodes or buboes. These hard lumps growing on the neck, armpits, or groin, like clotted blood, as one account put it, were the telltale sign of the bubonic plague. The feeling of these buboes growing under the skin must have been excruciating, a deep, throbbing pain accompanied by a raging fever. Imagine the skin stretched taut over the swelling, the color turning dark or purplish, an angry sign of the infection consuming the body. This sensation of localized, fiery pain was one of the first indicators that the fever was far more serious than a seasonal cold. The second term, Tuxuwen, or spitting blood plague, points directly to the pneumonic plague, the most lethal and contagious form of the illness. This form attacks the lungs and allows for person-to-person transmission through coughing. The description of victims suddenly spat blood and died is clinical in its brevity, a horrifying snapshot of the disease's efficiency. The sound of that cough, a wet, ragged expulsion of bloody sputum, must have created widespread panic, as it meant the air itself was infected, turning every interaction into a potentially fatal risk. The texture of the bloody phlegm, a thick metallic residue, would have been a horrifying last sensation for the victim, and a terrifying warning for anyone nearby. This is a legitimate historical event of symptom description. While the records are few, the correlation between the hard lumps and the bloody cough with the two primary forms of the plague, bubonic and pneumonic, is too strong to dismiss easily. These descriptions from local Chinese gazettes are essential evidence suggesting that the catastrophe afflicting China was indeed the same pathogen that ravaged the Middle East and Europe. An odd or unusual detail is that unlike in Europe, where the massive die-off of rats often preceded the human outbreak, the Chinese records of the 14th century do not explicitly mention a mass rat mortality. This could be due to the nature of the surviving records, which prioritized administrative and political events over natural observations. Or, as some historians suggest, it might hint that the highly contagious pneumonic form was dominant in the North China Plain, bypassing the need for a persistent rat flea vector in dense human settlements. It's a bit like having a sophisticated delivery system. Once the pneumonic plague starts, the rats can take a break. The humans are doing the spreading for them. Despite the lack of detailed medical treatises from the Yuan era itself, the later coining of the term shuyi, rat pestilence, centuries later during the Ming and Qing dynasties, shows that Chinese physicians eventually did connect the disease to rodents. The continuity of the illness and the retrospective analysis by later physicians like Wu Yuk, who developed a theory of pestilential agents known as Li Qi, or epidemic vapors, after witnessing plague in the 17th century, helps us understand how the 14th century catastrophe might have been interpreted. Wu Yuk described a toxin that spread through the air, a concept close to contagion even without a modern germ theory. Historians still debate the extent to which the 14th century Chinese epidemics were primarily bubonic plague versus a combination of other famine-related diseases such as typhus or dysentery. This academic debate rests on the fragmentary nature of the records. However, the unique combination of the lumps and the spitting blood is a compelling fingerprint that points towards Yersinia pestis. The sense of utter physical misery during the outbreak was constant. The victims would experience severe chills and a deep bone-aching exhaustion before the fever began. The internal feeling of the body giving up the complete loss of strength made even the smallest movement an impossible task. The high fever would make the victim feel intensely hot, a searing temperature that left the skin dry and burning, while inside the body the organs began to shut down. The air in the houses would be stifling heavy with the smell of sweat sickness, and the acrid scent of traditional herbal medicines burned in a desperate attempt to ward off the miasma or bad air. This era's focus on literal, descriptive naming is a fascinating cultural detail. Instead of abstract or mythological names, they named the disease exactly what it did to you. It gave you bumps, and it made you cough up blood. This directness captures the raw, terrifying reality of the experience. The devastating impact of the plague and the concurrent famine is perhaps best personalized in the story of Zhu Yuanzhang, a young peasant who would later rise from obscurity to found the Ming Dynasty as the Hongwu Emperor. His early life serves as a brutal microcosm of the generalized suffering that gripped China in the mid-14th century, a tangible example of the era's despair. In 1344, a year marked by intense drought, locust infestations, and widespread famine, a great epidemic struck Fengyang, a poor county in Anhui province where Zhu Yuanzhang's family lived. This is the legitimate historical event that shaped the future emperor. The official Ming history records that in that year, during the year of drought, locusts, famine, and an epidemic, Zhu Yuanzhang's parents and elder brother died one after the other. His peasant family was so destitute that they couldn't even afford proper burial and coffins. The sheer exhaustion and grief of surviving this triple catastrophe, famine, plague, and loss, must have been overwhelming. The feeling of utter coldness and emptiness settling in the tiny family hut after the final death, knowing he was now completely alone in a disintegrating world, is a heartbreaking image. While the source doesn't explicitly name the disease, later historians have strongly speculated that the epidemic which wiped out Zhu Yuanzhang's family was the widespread Black Death then ravaging the north and central plains of China. The timing and the circumstances fit the broader pattern of Yersinia pestis, circulating through the central provinces, often striking hardest in communities already weakened by hunger. It is an odd or unusual detail that the founder of a new, powerful dynasty was a direct survivor of the pandemic that helped destroy the previous one. He was essentially an orphaned refugee of the plague, forced to wander China seeking survival, first as a beggar and later as a Buddhist novice in a monastery. This is a bit like saying that the person who eventually won the lottery first had to survive being struck by lightning. The trauma of this personal loss and the subsequent years of wandering and begging must have instilled in the young Zhu a profound understanding of the misery of the common people and the utter failure of the Yuan state to protect them. This experience likely fueled his later drive for change and his ruthless efficiency in rebuilding China. When he later became emperor, he instituted policies to repopulate the empty north, an implicit testimony to the vast depopulation he had witnessed and survived. Historians still debate the specific identity of the pathogen that killed his family, but the context of mass death associated with the 1344 wave strongly suggests it was part of the Black Death pandemic. Regardless of the exact bacterial strain, the emotional and physical toll of the sickness and starvation propelled him onto a life path that would ultimately lead him to lead the Red Turban Rebellion and seize power. The sensory experience of this time was one of constant physical and emotional strain. Imagine the taste of the meager food often spoiled or insufficient, the constant gnawing hunger, contrasted with the fear of catching the fever that killed his family. The feel of the rough, threadbare clothes he wore as a wandering monk, the cold of the road under his feet, and the constant low-level pain of perpetual hunger would have been his daily reality. His body, though hardened by labor, carried the invisible scars of surviving the famine and the plague, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. The rise of Zhu Yuanzhang is a powerful reminder that even in the face of widespread collapse and overwhelming natural catastrophe, individual resilience can still shape history. His personal tragedy became a catalyst for dynastic change. The future emperor's ability to survive the plague and the subsequent years of extreme hardship gave him an edge. He was a leader forged in the crucible of apocalypse, understanding implicitly the desperation of the rebels he would come to lead. This is why his story is so poignant. It links the invisible microbiological threat of the plague directly to the visible political collapse of the empire. After the initial outbreaks of the 1330s and the local devastation like that experienced by Zhu Yuanzhang's family, the plague did not disappear. Instead, it struck in a series of terrifying pulses throughout the 1350s, reaching a climactic crescendo that coincided almost perfectly with the final political collapse of the Yuan Dynasty. These were not just minor resurgences. This was a widespread wave of epidemics that stretched across the empire. This legitimate historical event of the 1353–1354 wave is particularly well documented in the sense that later compilations indicate the pestilence spread to at least 8 distinct regions of China. These provinces spanned from the northern heartland like Hebei and Shanxi, down through the central regions of Henan and Jiangxi, and even reaching the far southern provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi. This wide geographical reach shows the plague was now circulating through the main internal arteries of the empire, likely facilitated by the chaos of war and the movement of refugees. The accounts of the toll are horrific. One report claims that over 2/3 of the population in parts of Shanxi had perished, and 6 or 7 out of 10 people had died in Hebei. Even a few years later, in 1358, localized outbreaks in Shanxi and Hebei reportedly claimed over 200,000 lives in that year alone. The cumulative effect of these repeated strikes was catastrophic. The sound of ceaseless crying and the ritualistic banging of gongs meant to ward off evil spirits must have been the defining soundscape of the mid-14th century, blending with the noise of escalating rebellion. What makes this pattern an odd or unusual detail is that it doesn't appear as a single, rapid, contiguous sweep like the Black Death in Europe, which moved steadily across the continent in about 4 years. Instead, the Chinese experience seems to have been a series of geographically patchy eruptions, smoldering in some areas and flaring up violently in others, only reaching its peak in the 1350s after the European cataclysm had mostly subsided. Historians still debate whether this timing discrepancy suggests a slower spread due to the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, or if it indicates the involvement of multiple strains or other diseases mixed with the plague. Maybe the Mongol trade routes that had brought the plague in were too disrupted by war to spread it efficiently out of the initial northern focus. The sensory experience of this period was defined by the feeling of being utterly besieged. Imagine the intense smell of fear and desperation clinging to the air, mingled with the earthy stench of hastily dug mass graves. The emotional exhaustion was total. People couldn't afford to mourn anymore because they were too busy trying to survive the next day, find food, or avoid the spreading rebellions. The feeling of hopelessness would have been an oppressive, constant weight, a psychological burden heavier than any physical task. Every new ache or feverish flush would have triggered pure terror. The spread down the Grand Canal corridor and along river systems was likely facilitated by merchant traffic and the vast movement of people fleeing the civil war. The breakdown of infrastructure and the abandonment of local government offices, the yamen, meant that there was no organized resistance to the disease. The plague just followed the paths of human movement, turning major waterways into conduits of contagion. It's a dark twist of fate that the very lifelines of the empire, the canals and roads, became its death channels, a bit like your water pipes suddenly carrying poison instead of water. This climactic series of pulses in the 1350s was the final nail in the Yuan Dynasty's coffin. The inability of the Mongol court to manage the famine, the floods, and now this overwhelming wave of pestilence was the clearest possible sign that they had lost the mandate of heaven. The sheer scale of depopulation and social chaos provided the perfect environment for the Red Turban Rebellion to gain strength, drawing followers from the millions of dislocated, starving, and traumatized survivors like Zhu Yuanzhang. The plague did not start the rebellion, but it certainly gave the rebels plenty of empty land to conquer and plenty of enraged and despairing people to recruit. One of the most striking aspects of the plague's impact in China is its uneven geography of death. The catastrophe was not felt uniformly across the vast Yuan Empire. Instead, contemporary observers and later historians both remarked on a distinct regional disparity in mortality, with northern China suffering far more catastrophically than the south. This legitimate historical event of regional difference is reflected in rough census figures. While northern provinces like Hebei and Shandong saw their populations plummet drastically, reportedly dropping from 3 million in 1207 to only 1 million by 1393, the Yangtze Delta region, known as Jiangnan in the south, fared considerably better. The Jiangnan area saw a decline of less than 10% during the same mid-14th century period, and its population even managed to stabilize or grow slightly in some areas. This enormous difference in survival rates is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have for the specific nature of the disaster in China. The question of why this occurred is a fascinating subject of discussion. It's an odd or unusual detail when contrasted with the European experience, where mortality rates were generally more uniform across regions of similar density. One theory suggests that the North China Plain was the primary point of entry for the plague from Central Asia along the steppes and trade routes. Furthermore, the North had already been severely weakened by years of continuous drought, locusts, famine, and military turmoil. A starving, displaced, and immune-compromised population was ripe for devastation. The people in the north were literally the low-hanging fruit for the plague. The south, particularly the fertile Jiangnan region, while certainly affected by famine and smaller epidemics, may have had different ecological conditions that hindered the plague's spread. Perhaps the species of rat or the prevalence of the specific flea vector were different. Some speculate that the architecture and sanitation practices in the south may have been less conducive to the dense infestations of the black rat, the typical carrier of the bubonic form. Southern communities also had better access to reliable water sources, which may have reduced the prevalence of waterborne diseases like dysentery, meaning fewer competing illnesses to compound the plague's lethality. Historians still debate the role of the natural plague reservoirs in southwest China's Yunnan province. While Yunnan is the natural home of Yersinia pestis and was the source of the third pandemic in 1894, the evidence suggests the 14th century wave came from the northwest and primarily scourged the north. It's possible the north and south were experiencing two separate, simultaneous disease ecologies, but the catastrophic demographic collapse was concentrated in the north. This suggests the plague entered China through the Mongol heartlands, ravaged the north, and then the epidemic fire simply ran out of fuel before it could uniformly engulf the more ecologically stable south. The sensory experience of this regional difference must have been stark. Imagine traveling south from the desolate, silent, and ruined villages of Hebei, where the air was thick with the dust of abandoned fields and the lingering scent of death, to the comparatively bustling, green, and vibrant rice paddies of the Yangtze Delta. The relief of the South's survivors would have been palpable, a sense of having been granted a reprieve by fate. Their sense of smell would register the wet, earthy smell of the paddies and the comforting scent of wood smoke from active hearths, a complete contrast to the cold desolation of the north. This uneven pattern of mortality significantly impacted the subsequent course of Chinese history. The massive depopulation of the north created an administrative and agricultural vacuum that the future Ming Dynasty would have to actively fill, forcing them to implement huge state-sponsored migration programs to repopulate the empty plains and revive farming. This imbalance served as a powerful incentive for rebellion, as the North's misery provided the manpower for the Red Turban armies, while the relative stability of the South provided the economic base that supported the eventual conquerors, a historical paradox. The devastating, repeated waves of pestilence, combined with war and famine, led to a demographic collapse in 14th century China that is nearly unimaginable in its scale. The cumulative effect of these disasters pushed the population down to a breaking point, fundamentally reshaping the Chinese landscape and society for centuries to come. This legitimate historical event of population collapse is frequently cited with staggering estimates. Some figures suggest that China's population plummeted from around 120 million in the mid-13th century to perhaps as low as 65 million by the end of the 14th century. In other words, over the course of just a few generations, nearly half of the population may have been lost. While some modern scholars argue these figures are inflated, pointing out that the different census methods used by the Song, Yuan, and early Ming dynasties make direct comparison difficult, there is no doubt whatsoever that millions of lives were extinguished due to the convergence of plague, war, and starvation. The Yuan government's census methods were an odd or unusual detail because they were often incomplete. They frequently missed displaced persons, refugees, and semi-nomadic groups, meaning the population figures were likely always an undercount. This makes the true scale of the death toll harder to pin down. Nevertheless, the physical evidence of abandoned villages, untilled fields, and the desperate efforts of the subsequent Ming dynasty to repopulate the North China plain implicitly testify to the massive loss of life. One later Ming source, reflecting on the Yuan's end, noted that in some counties, the dead were so numerous that there was no one to bury them. The sensation of walking through a vast expanse of deserted land with nothing but the sighing wind and the lingering smell of decay must have been a haunting experience for the few travelers. The period's chroniclers didn't isolate plague deaths from war or famine deaths. They spoke of a general apocalyptic population decline. The sense of an entire civilization unraveling was pervasive. This generalized catastrophe lent immense credence to the belief that the mandate of heaven had been definitively withdrawn from the Mongol rulers. Everything seemed to confirm it. The Yellow River catastrophically changing course in 1351, the constant rebellions, and the omnipresent disease. The heavens themselves seemed to be frowning upon the dynasty. Historians still debate the precise contribution of the Black Death versus famine and warfare to this overall demographic decline. Some scholars argue that the chaos and civil war in the late Yuan were the dominant killers, with the plague merely riding on the back of the resulting misery. Others contend that the speed and selectivity of the plague made it the primary driver of mortality in specific, localized outbreaks. What is clear is that these forces created a lethal synergy, each multiplying the effects of the others. The profound exhaustion of the survivors was not just physical, but psychological. The constant fear of the unseen killer, the grief over lost loved ones, and the overwhelming task of keeping order and finding food in a society falling apart left people drained and demoralized. The collective memory of this time was one of total collapse, a sense of having been abandoned by both man and the heavens. The texture of existence was gritty, characterized by dust, hunger, and the pervasive cold dread of the next inevitable disaster. The catastrophic combination of famine, war, and the recurrent waves of plague led inexorably to the political collapse of the Yuan Dynasty. For the Chinese populace, this triple disaster was the clearest possible sign that the Mongol rulers had fundamentally failed in their sacred duty and that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. This belief in the mandate of heaven is a legitimate historical event in Chinese political thought. It dictates that the emperor's right to rule is granted by heaven based on his virtuous conduct and ability to ensure the prosperity and stability of the realm. When the empire was battered by relentless floods, locusts, famine, and pestilence, all seen as unnatural disasters, it was proof positive that the current dynasty had lost heaven's approval. The fact that the plague struck the northern heartland, the very seat of Mongol power, was seen as especially significant a cosmic judgment on the capital itself. The feeling of political instability was almost as oppressive as the fear of the disease. The constant sound of local officials fleeing or dying and the subsequent breakdown of law and order must have made the survivors feel completely abandoned. There was no one to turn to for justice or protection. The breakdown of the postal system and the disruption of local governance meant that the Yuan state simply vanished from many communities. This total vacuum of authority provided the perfect opportunity for rebellion. This chaos was brilliantly exploited by millenarian sects, most notably the White Lotus Society and the leaders of the Red Turban Rebellion, which erupted in 1351. They framed the ongoing chaos, including the plague, in religious and apocalyptic terms. They taught that the world was ending and predicted the advent of the Maitreya Buddha, who would usher in a new era of peace. It's an odd or unusual detail that a microbiological disaster could so effectively fuel a religious and political revolution, yet the plague provided the tangible proof that the old world was indeed ending. Imagine the despair of the common people. They had witnessed whole families die in agony and saw local officials themselves succumb to the sickness. Their sense of smell would pick up the reek of unburied corpses and the metallic tang of rebellion in the air, a mixture of despair and desperate hope. It must have felt like a terrifying, necessary cleansing. The rebels' message of divine deliverance tapped directly into this widespread despair and the hope for a morally pure new beginning. Historians still debate the specific role of the plague in the timing of the rebellion. Some argue that the need for massive labor projects to control the disastrous Yellow River flood of 1351 concentrated thousands of desperate, starving peasants, making them a volatile pool of potential recruits for the Red Turbans. The plague then swept through these camps of displaced workers, pushing them past the breaking point and into open revolt. It was a potent mix. Famine provided the cause, the government's response provided the mass gathering, and the plague provided the final, fatal push into revolution. The future Ming emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, was a perfect example of this. As a plague and famine survivor and a former Buddhist novice, he understood the religious, social, and economic roots of the misery. His eventual success was built upon the ruins left by the pestilence. After the Ming Dynasty was established in 1368, the massive state-sponsored efforts to repopulate the empty lands of the north were the ultimate, implicit testimony to the plague's profound demographic toll and the central role it played in the collapse of the Yuan state. The war and the plague were two sides of the same coin of destruction, ending the Mongol era and paving the way for a new Han Chinese dynasty. In the face of the inexplicable death and societal collapse wrought by the plague, the Chinese people, like those in the West, sought both medical treatment and spiritual solace. Chinese medieval medicine, for all its sophistication, interpreted the epidemic through its own established lens, centered on the concepts of balance and pernicious vapors. Chinese physicians did not possess a modern understanding of contagion or germ theory, but they did recognize the spread of disease through li qi, or pestilential vapors, and wen yi, or epidemic qi. Energy. A fast-killing epidemic fever with swollen lymph nodes would most likely have been classified as a form of wen yi pestilence, or perhaps a kind of intense heat disease, Bing, given the high fevers. This classification is a legitimate historical event in the history of Chinese medicine, as doctors worked within their existing framework to categorize this fierce new sickness. The medical response was thus limited by the era's knowledge. Physicians would likely have employed classical methods, prescribing herbal decoctions to clear internal heat and detoxify the system, giving advice on avoiding bad air or miasma, and often performing lancing of the buboes to drain the pus, a common practice for abscesses. We have hints that people sought protective measures such as burning aromatic herbs like mugwort to fumigate their houses, believing the smoke could purge the harmful epidemic vapors. The strong, pungent smell of these herbs would have temporarily masked the scent of sickness and decay, offering a psychological sense of action and control. An odd or unusual detail is the lack of a distinct, dedicated medical treatise on the 14th century plague. Doctors at the time may not have recognized it as a single, unique disease, different from other recurring, lethal epidemics, especially since it was intertwined with famine and war. It wasn't until the 17th century, with physician Wu Yuke, that a more structured theory of highly contagious pestilential agents was developed, retrospectively providing a framework for understanding the earlier outbreaks. Historians still debate the efficacy of these traditional treatments. Just like in Europe and the Middle East, no effective cure for the plague existed in 14th century China. The treatments were palliative, cooling the fever, trying to manage the swelling, but they could not stop the systemic infection. However, some practical measures were probably adopted based on folk wisdom, such as avoiding contact with the sick or quickly disposing of corpses, born out of simple observation of person-to-person spread. Beyond medicine, people turned to spiritual protection. Confucian scholars viewed the epidemic as a political omen, a sign of heaven's displeasure. The Yuan court's common response was to order rituals to appease heaven and earth, or perform general amnesties to mollify celestial anger. Locally, communities relied on popular religion, often invoking the 5 plague gods or performing exorcisms and parades carrying images of plague demons. The cacophony of these rituals, the rhythmic chanting of monks, the ringing of bells, the loud beating of drums during exorcism parades, was a desperate attempt to drive away the invisible, malevolent forces believed to be spreading the sickness. This was the spiritual sound of resistance against an incomprehensible killer. While the Chinese populace turned to herbs and prayers, the official response of the Yuan government to the massive epidemics was noticeably limited and, in many respects, inadequate compared to the immediate practical measures adopted by city-states in the West. This lack of a rigorous, centralized health strategy is a key part of the Chinese plague story. The most visible official actions taken by the Yuan state were often administrative, rather than medical. This is a legitimate historical event captured in the imperial records. The government granted tax relief and excused communities from corvée labor obligations, unpaid labor duties, in areas suffering high mortality. This was a tacit acknowledgement of the scale of the depopulation. It made little sense to demand taxes or labor from communities where 6 or 7 out of 10 taxpayers had died. This relief, though helpful to the survivors, was entirely reactive, a bureaucratic adjustment to disaster, not a measure of containment. An odd or unusual detail when comparing the East and West is the absence of quarantine in China. While Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa quickly realized the effectiveness of isolating ships, travelers, and the sick, leading to the institutionalization of the quarantina, a 40-day isolation, the Yuan state never implemented a systematic quarantine system. This wasn't due to ideological opposition to the idea of contagion. Chinese folk wisdom acknowledged avoiding the sick, but rather the sheer logistical difficulty of imposing it across a vast land-based, internally fractured empire that was already crumbling under rebellion. Historians still debate whether a quarantine system would have been effective in the late Yuan given the widespread prevalence of the highly contagious pneumonic plague, which can spread quickly through the air regardless of physical barriers. Moreover, the political breakdown meant many local government offices, yamen, were abandoned as officials fled or died, making large-scale public health measures impossible to enforce. Amid the chaos, the most crucial public health problem was the disposal of the dead. Unburied corpses posed a sanitation problem and were a potent symbol of disorder. We know that later dynasties, like the Ming and Qing, would order the creation of temporary cemeteries or mass graves outside city walls and provide funds for burial. It is highly likely that diligent local administrators in the Yuan era took similar ad hoc measures, setting up plague cemeteries to handle the swaths of dead. Imagine the intense labor, the heavy, numbing work of digging those vast pits, the survivors' bodies aching with exhaustion and their minds struggling to process the sheer volume of the dead. The feel of the cold, dry earth on their hands as they buried their neighbors in anonymity must have been a profoundly dehumanizing experience. Ultimately, much of the immediate coping was left to the communities themselves. Another de facto response, driven by survival, was migration. People fled the worst-hit northern villages for safer, less affected locales, or joined refugee flows fleeing famine. This migration sometimes broke the chain of transmission if entire communities dispersed, but it also likely carried the disease further along major transport routes, such as the Grand Canal, contributing to the patchy spread of the epidemics. The only organized relief was often the desperate movement away from the source of death. The story of the Black Death in China is fragmented and, as we've seen, often silent in official Chinese records, a stark contrast to the dramatic and often exaggerated accounts that traveled west. This difference between foreign whispers and Chinese silence is a key feature of the pandemic's history in Asia. As we discussed, European and Middle Eastern writers, having no direct contact with the collapsing Yuan Empire in the 1350s, filled the information vacuum with speculation. This is a legitimate historical event of transcontinental rumor. Foreign chroniclers like the Florentine monk Matteo Villani mentioned rumors that in Cathay, China, and India, 20 million people died of the plague before it even came west. While inaccurate, this staggering number shows how information was magnified, turning China into the mythical, distant land where the plague began. Another foreign observer, Gabriele de Musi, linked the outbreak directly to the land of the Tartars, Mongols, and caravans of traders bringing death, implicitly blaming the Mongol trade routes for the scourge that eventually hit the Mediterranean. The odd or unusual detail here is the relative restraint of the surviving Chinese records. Unlike the rich narrative accounts, diaries, and political tracts that emerged from the European crisis, which give us stories of individual fear and moral debates, Chinese official histories prioritized concise, factual accounts. Entries in the Yuan history simply note a major epidemic and a mortality estimate, often alongside other disasters like floods and rebellions. There is no Chinese Giovanni Boccaccio to give us tales of the plague's human cost. This difference is partly due to genre. Chinese official histories were designed to convey the political and cosmic implications of events, not the personal. Historians still debate the reasons for this narrative silence. Some argue the sheer number of simultaneous crises in the late Yuan era, war, famine, flood, and rebellion, meant the plague was simply one thread in a larger tapestry of dynastic collapse. To a historian writing a few decades later, the fall of the empire and the battles of the Red Turban Rebellion were the primary events, with the epidemics being a contributing, but not isolated factor. It's like being caught in a fire, a flood, and a tornado all at once. You don't focus on the temperature of the fire, you just focus on survival. Conversely, the foreign perspective was focused on finding a clear source for the unprecedented calamity. Blaming distant Asia and the Mongol traders provided a simple narrative explanation for the disaster that struck Europe. It is a powerful illustration of how the plague was perceived differently in different locales. In Europe, it was a singular crisis, a terrifying break from the norm. In China, it was tragically woven into the fabric of the empire's final chaotic years. It is fascinating, though, that a Chinese scholar, retrospectively, could also summarize that merchants from Tibet carried the plague west along the Silk Road, confirming that, from both ends, medieval observers recognized the disaster as a shared, transcontinental pandemic. The fragmented nature of the Chinese records has, in recent decades, led to a robust and crucial academic debate. How certain can we truly be that the 14th century Yuan epidemics were, in fact, the bubonic plague? While the traditional consensus points to an Asian origin for the Black Death, a skeptical counterargument forces us to look closer at the evidence. This is a legitimate historical event of academic scrutiny, led most prominently by historians like George Sussman and Timothy Brooke. They urge caution in definitively labeling the Yuan-era death waves as Black Death without clear, explicit proof. Their skepticism rests on several points. First, the lack of detailed symptom descriptions is a major concern. Outside of the few brief local accounts mentioning hard lumps and spitting blood, Chinese central records for the 1330s to 1350s lack the rich clinical detail, like descriptions of mass rat die-offs or the rapid dark discoloration of the buboes that characterized European and Middle Eastern accounts. Chinese historians mainly noted the scale of death, not the specific nature of the illness. Second, the pattern of the spread in China is an odd or unusual detail that doesn't perfectly match the European model. Instead of one rapid, contiguous wave, the Chinese epidemics appeared as a series of regional, patchy eruptions across the north and central provinces, seemingly sparing the deep south and southwest. The skeptics argue that this pattern suggests a multi-causal epidemic, a combination of diseases like typhus, dysentery, and hemorrhagic fever, perhaps with plague as a secondary factor, all exacerbated by famine and war. Third, there are timing discrepancies. While the European Black Death peaked from 1347 to 1351, the most extensive Chinese epidemic wave seems to occur in the early 1350s, after Europe had already been ravaged. Historians still debate whether this gap suggests a slower secondary wave or if it indicates that the Chinese events were entirely separate diseases. It's possible that the initial wave in the 1330s was the plague, but the subsequent waves were a mix. Conversely, those who maintain the presence of the Black Death point to the sheer catastrophic mortality, a sign of the plague's unique lethality, and the post facto logic that the same pandemic striking the rest of Eurasia must have also afflicted the interconnected Mongol territory. They argue that the absence of detailed records is due to the genre of Chinese official history and the chaos of dynastic collapse, not the absence of the disease itself. They believe the brief mentions of lumps and spitting blood are the unique fingerprint of Yersinia pestis. The sensory feeling associated with this skepticism is one of frustration and intellectual uncertainty. Imagine the historian poring over dusty, fragmentary texts, their eyes straining to find a single, definitive word or description. The cold intellectual realization that the puzzle pieces might never fully align. The feeling of the paper's roughness under their fingertips contrasts with the smooth, logical flow of the narrative they wish they could write, highlighting the profound difficulty of confirming medical realities from 1,000 years past. The consensus today leans toward a nuanced view. The plague was almost certainly present in 14th century China and contributed to devastating regional epidemics, especially in the north. However, its impact was not a precise mirror of the European experience, and it was tragically intertwined with famine and war, making the exact calculation of its death toll a perpetual subject of debate. After its destructive rampage through the Yuan Empire in the 1330s and 1350s, the plague did not become endemic in Chinese cities to the same extent it did in Europe. This raises a crucial question. Why did the plague wane in China while it persisted in Europe for centuries, recurring every decade or so? The gradual subsiding of the plague in China by the 1360s, coinciding with the rise of the Ming Dynasty, is a fascinating and legitimate historical event that remains a subject of ongoing research. Several theories attempt to explain this difference. One hypothesis is that the massive initial mortality, particularly in the north, broke the chain of transmission. The vast depopulation meant that the disease simply ran out of susceptible human hosts in many areas. Similarly, the local populations of the primary vector, the black rat and its specific fleas, might have been significantly depleted or developed some immunity, disrupting the crucial rat-flea-human cycle. Another factor could be environmental. The period in the late 1350s and 1360s saw some colder spells, which might have made conditions less favorable for the breeding and activity of the specific flea species, Xenocilla chiopis, responsible for bubonic transmission. The feel of the crisp, dry, cold air of the northern winters contrasting with the humid conditions needed for flea proliferation may have acted as a natural check on the disease. The socio-political shift also played a major role. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire and the chaos of the Civil War led to a temporary contraction of long-distance trade. This is an odd or unusual detail. The very force that brought the plague to China also ironically helped to smother it by reducing the movement of infected rodents and fleas across regions. The new Ming regime, focused on internal consolidation and agrarian stability, was initially less outwardly focused than the Yuan Dynasty, further slowing the continental flow of goods and pests. Furthermore, some historians suggest that traditional Chinese society's structure might have limited the disease's persistence. Chinese communities had long-standing practices of burying garbage and waste, which reduced rat infestations compared to the open sewer systems of many medieval European towns. The architecture, which often favored dispersed single-story homes, might have reduced human-to-flea contact compared to the tightly packed multi-story urban centers of Italy or England. Historians still debate the role of host immunity versus ecological factors. Was it because the survivors were genetically more resilient, or simply because the environment became less hospitable to the specific plague flea? Whatever the reason, the population recovery under the early Ming was significant, with the population doubling by the 16th century, a rate of rebound that suggests the absence of continuous, devastating plague outbreaks. While plague outbreaks did occur in later Ming and Qing China, notably in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were often sporadic and sometimes suspected of being reintroduced from abroad, possibly via renewed trade with Southeast Asia or India. This is a bit like a computer virus that is contained internally but keeps getting reintroduced via thumb drives. The sensory memory of the 14th century horror faded, replaced by the heavy, arduous work of rebuilding the infrastructure and the economy of the new empire, a feeling of physical exhaustion born not of sickness, but of necessary labor. The story of the Black Death in Yuan China ultimately serves as a powerful reminder that this was a truly pan-Eurasian catastrophe, a shared human tragedy that spanned continents and cultures long before the term globalization existed. China's experience was integral to the pandemic's history, acting as both an endpoint for the disease traveling west and a deeply affected region in its own right. We can envision the plague entering China via two main routes from Central Asia: the steppe route leading into northern China and the Silk Road caravan route into the Gansu corridor and the interior. Both routes deposited the disease first in the north and northwest, confirming the interconnectedness fostered by the Mongol Empire. From there, it jumped along the internal trade arteries, like the Grand Canal and various river systems, to reach central and southern provinces in those destructive pulses of the 1350s. A poignant legitimate historical event that encapsulates this shared fate comes from the perspective of the Middle East. While Europe was reeling in 1348, the scholar Ibn al-Wardi wrote that China was depopulated, India was depopulated, the land of the Uzbeks and the land of the Turks were depopulated. To him and his contemporaries, China was the distant, mythical origin point of the Great Killer, the first domino to fall. Meanwhile, a scholar in Yuan China in 1350 might have been writing that the plague was heaven's punishment on the Mongol rulers, not knowing that faraway peoples also suffered the same fate. This disconnect, this difference in perspective, highlights how the global event was interpreted through intensely local lenses. Historians still debate the total population loss and the specific causes of death in 14th century China, but the confluence of evidence, the archaeological data on the plague's Central Asian origin, the brief but precise Chinese symptom descriptions, and the undeniable demographic collapse strongly suggests that Yersinia pestis was a key, catastrophic factor. The Chinese experience, while not a perfect mirror of the European one, was an essential chapter of the Black Death. The odd or unusual detail is that after the chaos of the Yuan collapse, when the Ming Dynasty took power in 1368, they inherited a land so utterly shattered and depopulated that their immediate priority became massive state-sponsored rebuilding and repopulation efforts, the ultimate testimony to the plague's devastation. This rebuilding phase marked the final subsidence of the plague's great wave in China. The sensory details of this final phase must have been the smell of fresh earth being turned over, the heavy, rhythmic thud of hoes and shovels, replacing the stench of death and the sounds of lamentation. The survivors, like the future emperor Zhu Yuanzhang, possessed a deep, indelible memory of the catastrophe. They were hardened by years of famine and fear, and their resolve to rebuild gave the early Ming era a profound sense of purpose. The trauma of the Black Death was thus transformed into the energy of recovery. In the end, the Black Death in Yuan China stands as a cautionary tale. It teaches us about the vulnerability of even the mightiest empires to microscopic foes and the profound importance of historical record-keeping. By weaving together the sparse Chinese annals with foreign chronicles and modern genetic science, we gain a more complete and nuanced picture of the 14th century plague, a human disaster that spanned continents, with China very much included. The Black Death's journey through 14th century China is a story of profound devastation often overshadowed by the European narrative. This catastrophe, arriving along the trade routes of the vast Mongol Empire, struck a populace already weakened by drought, famine, and political turmoil, leading to waves of pestilence that peaked in the 1330s and 1350s. Chinese records, though sparse, chillingly describe the telltale symptoms of bubonic and pneumonic plague with terms like bump plague and spitting blood plague. The plague's uneven spread ravaged the North China Plain, contributing significantly to a catastrophic demographic collapse that may have halved the population in some regions and provided the ideal conditions for the Red Turban Rebellion. For the Chinese populace, this disaster was the ultimate sign that the Mongol-led Yuan Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. Leaders like Zhu Yuanzhang, the future founder of the Ming Dynasty, were survivors of the plague and famine, their personal tragedy fueling their political rise. Ultimately, while the plague did not become endemic in Chinese cities, as it did in Europe, its initial devastation was a crucial factor in the fall of the Yuan state. The story of its onset, its regional variation, and its intertwining with political collapse underscores that the Black Death was truly a pan-Eurasian catastrophe, a shared moment of apocalyptic suffering that indelibly marked the trajectory of Chinese history and the world. Good night.